It's late. You're probably tired. And before you close your eyes tonight, I want to tell you something. There's this story about a man named Temüjin. Now, you probably think you know who he is. You've heard the name Genghis Khan before. You know he conquered half the world. You know he built the largest empire in history. But that's not really his story. Not the real one, anyway. His story is about something else entirely. It's about a person who started with nothing. And I mean nothing. He was born into poverty on the harsh steppes of Mongolia. His father was murdered when he was just a boy. His family was abandoned by the tribe. He was enslaved. He was hunted. He was an outcast in every way that matters. And yet, somehow this man rose from absolute nothing to become the most powerful ruler the world has ever known. Think about that for a moment. How does that even happen? How does someone go from being a slave to commanding millions, from being rejected to being feared and respected across continents? That's the question I want to explore with you tonight. Because his answer might teach us something about ourselves. Something about what we're capable of when everything seems impossible. So settle in, get comfortable, and let me take you back to the steppes of Mongolia, to a time and place where survival itself was a daily struggle. Let me tell you how a boy named Temüjin became a legend. To understand Temüjin, you have to understand the world he was born into. And that world was nothing like ours. Imagine, if you will, a vast expanse of grassland stretching endlessly in every direction. No cities, no walls, no roads, just grass, sky, and the horizon that seems to go on forever. This was Mongolia in the 12th century. This was home to dozens of tribes, each one fiercely independent, each one convinced that their way was the only way. The Mongol tribes didn't farm. They didn't build permanent settlements. They were herders and hunters, constantly moving across the steppes, following their animals. Horses were everything to them. A man's wealth was measured in horses. His status came from how many he owned. His survival depended on knowing how to ride, how to hunt, how to live in the saddle. From the moment a child could walk, they learned to ride. By the time they were teenagers, they could spend entire days on horseback without falling off. It was simply what you did. It was simply who you were. The landscape itself was unforgiving. Winters on the steppes were brutal. Temperatures dropped so low that exposed skin would freeze in minutes. Blizzards came without warning, and if you were caught out in one, you died. It was that simple. The wind howled across the open plains with nothing to stop it, nothing to break its force. It cut through your clothes, through your skin, straight into your bones. And the summers, they brought their own challenges. Droughts could last for years. Grass would wither. Animals would starve. People would starve. This was a world where weakness meant death, where mercy was a luxury no one could afford. The tribes were constantly at war with each other, fighting over grazing lands, over water sources, over honor and pride. A man's reputation was everything. If you were strong, if you were brave, if you were loyal, people followed you. If you were weak, if you showed fear, if you betrayed your allies, you were cast out. And being cast out on the steppes was essentially a death sentence. The tribal structure was rigid and unforgiving. You were born into a tribe, and that determined everything about your life. Your tribe was your family, your protection, your identity. To be separated from your tribe was to be utterly alone, and alone on the steppes you didn't last long. This was the culture that shaped Temüjin. Honor, loyalty, strength, survival. These weren't abstract concepts. They were the rules by which people lived and died. Breaking them meant exile. Showing weakness meant being abandoned. Betrayal was the ultimate sin, the thing that could never be forgiven. The air on the steppes smelled of dust and animal hide. You could taste the grit in your mouth after a day of riding. The sound of hooves was constant. Thousands of horses moving across the grassland, the thunder of their movement, the neighing and snorting. At night the sky was so full of stars it seemed impossible. The darkness was complete and total. The cold was absolute. This was the world. This was the reality. And into this harsh, unforgiving landscape around the year 1162, a boy was born. A boy who would one day change everything. But first he would have to survive it. The boy's name was Temüjin. His father was a man named Yasuge, a minor tribal leader of the Kiat clan. Yasuge wasn't a great man. He wasn't famous. He was simply a warrior who'd managed to gather enough followers to be called a leader. He had some land, some horses, some respect. It wasn't much, but it was something. Temujin's mother was named Hoelun. She came from another tribe, the Olkunut. Yasuge had taken her as his wife, which in that culture meant he'd essentially claimed her. This was normal. This was how things worked. Tribes intermarried, alliances were formed. Children were born. Life continued, but Temujin's birth was marked by an omen. On the day he was born, Yasuge had just defeated a rival named Tatar in battle. The Tatars were enemies of the Kiat. They were a constant threat, so when Temujin was born on the same day his father defeated the Tatars, it seemed like a sign. Yasuge named his son Temujin, which meant the one who makes blacksmith's bellows. Or more poetically, the one who brings order. It was a name that carried hope. It was a name that suggested greatness. But names don't determine destiny. Not really. What determines destiny is what happens to you, what you endure, what you learn. When Temujin was about 9 years old, his father was murdered. Yasuge had been riding across the steppes when he encountered a man named Tatars. Not the tribe, but an individual. This man recognized Yasuge as an enemy, and so he poisoned him. It was a slow death. Yasuge lingered for days before finally succumbing. He died knowing he'd been defeated, knowing his killer would go unpunished, knowing his young son would be left unprotected. Think about that for a moment. Imagine being 9 years old and watching your father die. Imagine knowing that the man who protected you, who gave you your identity, who was supposed to teach you how to survive, was gone. And imagine knowing that the man who killed him was still out there, still alive, still a threat. When Yasuge died, something shifted in the tribal structure. Without a strong leader, the Kiat clan began to fracture. And without a father, Temujin became vulnerable. His mother Hoelun tried to hold the family together. She was a strong woman. She was intelligent and resourceful. But she was a woman in a man's world, and without a husband, she had no real power. The tribe that had followed Yasuge began to drift away. Some went to other leaders. Some simply disappeared into the vast expanse of the steppes. Within weeks, Temujin's family was alone. His mother, his younger siblings, his half-brother. Just a handful of people with no tribe, no protection, no future, internal dialogue. Temujin stood watching his tribe leave, watching the people he'd known his entire life turn their backs and ride away. He was old enough to understand what was happening. He was old enough to know that this was the beginning of the end. He thought, I am alone now. My father is dead. My tribe has abandoned us. I have nothing. But even at 9 years old, something in him refused to accept this. Something whispered, this is not the end. This is the beginning of something else. His mother tried to keep the family alive. She foraged for food. She hunted when she could. She did everything she could to survive on the steppes with 5 children. and no tribe. But the steppes don't care about effort. They don't reward good intentions. They only reward strength and luck. For years, Temüjin lived in poverty and fear. He was an outcast. The other tribes looked down on him. He had no status. He had no protection. He was vulnerable in every way. And on the steppes, vulnerability was the most dangerous thing you could be. But he was learning. He was learning how to survive. He was learning how to read people. He was learning that the world was cruel and that you couldn't depend on anyone but yourself. These lessons would shape everything he would become. When Temüjin was around 15 years old, his life took another turn for the worse. He was captured by the Tatars. Yes, the same tribe that had killed his father. This wasn't a coincidence. The Tatars knew who he was. They knew he was the son of Yesugei. And they wanted revenge. But they didn't kill him. Instead, they enslaved him. They took him to their camp and put him to work. He became a slave, a servant, someone with no rights and no future. He was forced to do the hardest labor. He was beaten when he worked too slowly. He was given barely enough food to survive. He was treated as less than human. Imagine that. You're 15 years old. You've already lost your father. You've already been abandoned by your tribe. And now you're enslaved by the people who killed your father. You're at the absolute bottom of society. You have nothing. You are nothing. But Temüjin didn't break. He didn't give up. He endured. He worked. He survived. And he watched. He watched how the Tatars operated. He watched their patterns. He learned their routines. He was gathering information, even if he didn't fully realize it at the time. After some time in captivity, Temüjin managed to escape. The details aren't entirely clear from history, but what we know is that he got away. He fled into the wilderness. He was alone, hunted with nothing but his wits and his determination. He had to find food. He had to find shelter. He had to survive in the open steppes with people looking for him. Internal dialogue. As he ran, as he hid in the grass and the darkness, Temüjin made a decision. He thought, I will never be enslaved again. Never. Even if I die, I will die free. I will never let another person own me. I will never let another person treat me as less than human. This is my vow. This is my promise to myself. This moment was crucial. This was the moment when Temüjin transformed from a victim into something else. He was still young. He was still vulnerable. But something had changed inside him. His suffering had forged something hard and unbreakable. He made his way back to his mother and his siblings. They were still alive, still struggling, still trying to survive on the margins of society. But now, Temüjin was different. He was harder. He was more determined. He was someone who'd faced the worst and survived. The years of slavery and captivity had taught him something crucial. They'd taught him that the world didn't care about fairness. They'd taught him that power was the only thing that mattered. They taught him that if you wanted to survive, if you wanted to thrive, you had to be stronger than your enemies. You had to be smarter. You had to be more ruthless. These lessons would stay with him forever. They would shape every decision he made. They would drive him forward when others would have given up. The boy who'd been enslaved would one day enslave millions. The boy who'd been powerless would one day hold more power than anyone in history. But that was still far in the future. For now, he was just a young man trying to survive. Just a teenager with nothing but his will and his determination. Just a boy who'd learned that the world was cruel, and that if you wanted to survive, you had to be crueler still. As Temüjin grew into manhood, he began to understand something fundamental about the steppes. You couldn't survive alone. You couldn't build anything alone. Power didn't come from individual strength, though strength mattered. Power came from relationships. Power came from loyalty. Power came from convincing other people to follow you, to believe in you, to stand beside you when everything was falling apart. This understanding would become the foundation of everything he built. Around the time Temüjin was in his late teens or early 20s, he met a man named Togrul Khan. Togrul Khan, also known as Ong Khan, was the leader of the Keret tribe. The Keret were more powerful than the Kiyat. They had more warriors. They had more horses. They had more influence. Togrul Khan was a man of some importance on the steppes. Now here's where it gets interesting. Temüjin's father Yesuge had once done Togrul Khan a favor. Years earlier, before Temüjin was even born, Yesuge had helped Togrul Khan in some conflict. It was a debt that had never been forgotten, and Temüjin, understanding the importance of such things, decided to call in that debt. He went to Togrul Khan and reminded him of what Yesuge had done. He asked for protection. He asked for an alliance. And Togrul Khan, remembering his obligation to Temüjin's father, agreed. It was a calculated move on Temüjin's part. He was using his father's legacy as currency. He was leveraging the past to build the future. This was politics. This was strategy. With Togrul Khan's protection, Temüjin's position improved dramatically. He was no longer a powerless outcast. He was now connected to a powerful leader. Other tribes began to take notice. Other people began to see him differently. He wasn't just a poor boy anymore. He was someone with allies, someone with backing. But Togrul Khan wasn't the only important relationship Temüjin formed during this period. There was another man named Jamuka. Jamuka was from a different tribe, but he and Temüjin became close friends. They became blood brothers, which in that culture was a sacred bond. It meant they swore loyalty to each other. It meant they would stand together against any enemy. It meant they were bound by something deeper than family. At least that's what it meant at the beginning. Jamuka was intelligent. He was ambitious. He was a skilled warrior and a natural leader. In many ways, he was everything Temüjin was becoming. The two men spent time together. They hunted together. They talked about the future. They made plans. For a time, they were genuinely close. They were friends in the truest sense. But even as they were becoming blood brothers, there was something else happening beneath the surface. Both men were ambitious. Both men wanted power. Both men wanted to lead. And on the steppes, there was only room for one supreme leader. Eventually, their friendship would be tested. Eventually, it would break. But that was still in the future. For now, Temüjin was building. He was gathering followers. He was attracting people who believed in him. And this is where his genius really began to show. Temüjin understood something that most tribal leaders didn't understand. Most leaders inherited their position. They were born into power because their father was powerful. But Temüjin had to build his power from nothing. And in doing so, he developed a different philosophy. He didn't care where you came from. He didn't care if you were born noble or born a slave. He didn't care about your bloodline or your family connections. What he cared about was loyalty. What he cared about was ability. What he cared about was whether you would stand beside him and fight. This was revolutionary. In a society built on bloodline and inheritance, Temüjin was seeing that merit mattered, that loyalty mattered, that your actions mattered more than your birth. His first followers were people like him. They were outcasts. They were people who'd been rejected by their tribes. They were people who had nothing to lose. A man named Jamuka's brother joined him. A man named Subutai, who had become one of his greatest generals, joined him. These were people who saw in Temüjin something worth believing in. They saw someone who valued them, someone who would reward their loyalty. And Temüjin understood the importance of rewarding loyalty. When someone stood with him, when someone fought for him, he remembered it. He promoted them. He gave them status. He gave them a share of the spoils. He made them feel like they mattered. This was his strategy. This was how he built an army. Internal dialogue. As Temüjin watched his followers grow in number as he saw men from different tribes coming together under his banner, he began to see something. He thought, this is possible. Unity is possible. Not through conquest, not through force alone, but through loyalty, through showing people that I value them, that I will not abandon them like their tribes abandoned them, that I will reward their faith in me. He could see it now dimly like a vision forming in the distance. A Mongolia united, not a collection of warring tribes, but one people, one nation, one vision. But he also knew it wouldn't be easy. He knew there would be obstacles. He knew there would be people who opposed him. He knew that Jamuka, his blood brother, might one day stand against him. But for now, he was building. He was gathering. He was preparing for something greater than himself. For a time, everything seemed to be working. Temüjin's followers grew in number. His reputation spread across the steppes. People began to speak his name with respect. But success breeds jealousy, and jealousy breeds betrayal. Jamuka watched Temüjin's rise with growing unease. At first, they were equals. They were blood brothers. But slowly and perceptibly, Temüjin began to surpass him. More people followed Temüjin. More tribes aligned with Temüjin. More warriors wanted to serve under Temüjin's banner. And Jamuka, who'd once been his closest friend, began to resent him. The split didn't happen all at once. It happened gradually. Jamuka started gathering his own followers. He started positioning himself as an alternative to Temüjin. He began to whisper doubts about Temüjin's leadership. He started to undermine him in subtle ways. And then finally he made his move. Jamuka challenged Temüjin openly. He declared himself Temüjin's rival. He gathered the tribes that opposed Temüjin's vision and formed an alliance against him. The blood brothers had become enemies. The friendship had become war. But Jamuka wasn't Temüjin's only problem. There was also Conqueror Khan, the man who'd protected him in his early years. Conqueror Khan had been like a father figure to Temüjin. Temüjin had served him loyally. Temüjin had fought for him. Temüjin had made him stronger. But as Temüjin's power grew, Conqueror Khan began to see him as a threat rather than a protégé. The student was becoming stronger than the master. The young man was attracting more followers than the aging leader. And Conqueror Khan, like so many leaders before and after him, couldn't accept that. So Conqueror Khan did what many powerful people do when they feel threatened. He turned on Temüjin. He allied himself with Jamuka. Together they plotted against him. Together they decided that Temüjin had to be destroyed. It was a coordinated attack. Jamuka and Conqueror Khan brought their forces together. They had more warriors than Temüjin. They had more resources. They had more experience. By every measure, they should have won. They should have crushed him. Temüjin found himself in an impossible position. The man he'd trusted most had betrayed him. The man he'd called blood brother had turned against him. He was surrounded by enemies. He was outnumbered. He was facing annihilation. And in that moment, something crucial happened. Temüjin realized something that would define the rest of his life. He realized that he was truly alone. Not in a tragic sense, but in a liberating sense. He had no one to depend on but himself and the small band of followers who'd chosen to stand with him. He had no powerful allies to protect him. He had no safety net. He had nothing but his will and the loyalty of those who believed in him. Internal dialogue. Temüjin stood looking at the forces arrayed against him. He could see the banners of Jamuka's tribes. He could see Togrul Khan's warriors. He was outnumbered. He was outmatched. He was facing defeat. But in that moment, something shifted inside him. He thought, I will not be destroyed. I will not be defeated. These men think they know what they're doing, but they don't understand what they're facing. They don't understand that I have nothing left to lose. They don't understand that I've already lost everything. My father, my tribe, my freedom. And I survived all of it. I survived slavery. I survived abandonment. I survived being hunted. And I will survive this too. Not because I'm stronger than them, but because I'm more desperate. Because I have nothing left to lose. Because I will do whatever it takes. He made a decision in that moment. He decided to fight. Not because he was certain of victory. Not because he had any real reason to believe he could win. But because surrender meant death anyway. Because giving up meant the end of his vision. Because he'd come too far to turn back now. What happened next was remarkable. Temüjin's small band of followers, knowing they were facing impossible odds, chose to stand with him anyway. They could have abandoned him. They could have fled. They could have saved themselves. But they didn't. They chose to fight beside him. This was the moment that defined Temüjin's leadership. This was the moment when his strategy of loyalty and merit paid off. These men weren't fighting for him because they had to. They were fighting for him because they wanted to. Because they believed in him. Because they trusted him in a way they'd never trusted anyone else. The battles that followed were brutal. They were desperate. Temüjin's forces were smaller, but they were more unified. They were more disciplined. They were fighting for something greater than themselves. And slowly, against all odds, they began to prevail. Jamuka was defeated. Togrul Khan was defeated. The men who tried to destroy Temüjin found themselves on the losing side of history. And Temüjin, the boy who'd been enslaved, the young man who'd been abandoned, emerged victorious. But more importantly, he emerged transformed. He was no longer just a tribal leader. He was becoming something else entirely. He was becoming a visionary. He was becoming the man who would unite the steppes. The battles against Jamuka and Togrul Khan weren't quick victories. They were prolonged conflicts that tested everything Temüjin had learned about warfare and leadership. But they were victories nonetheless. And with each victory, something shifted on the steppes. Temüjin's first major success came when he defeated Jamuka's forces in direct combat. It wasn't a decisive, crushing blow. It was more like a series of skirmishes and engagements where Temüjin's superior tactics and discipline began to wear down his opponent. Jamuka's warriors were skilled, but they weren't unified in the way Temüjin's were. They were fighting for different reasons. Some were fighting for Jamuka because of tribal loyalty. Some were fighting because they'd been ordered to. Some were fighting because they had no choice. But Temüjin's warriors were different. They were fighting because they believed in him. They were fighting because he'd treated them with respect when no one else had. They were fighting because he'd shown them that a man's worth wasn't determined by his birth, but by his actions and his loyalty. When Togrul Khan's forces joined Jamuka's, the conflict intensified. But even with the combined strength of two powerful leaders, they couldn't match Temüjin's growing army. Why? Because Temüjin was doing something revolutionary. He was building an army based on merit, not bloodline. In traditional Mongol society, leadership positions were inherited. You were born into power or you weren't. Your tribe determined your status. Your family name determined your future. But Temüjin was changing all of that. He was saying that if you were skilled, if you were brave, if you were loyal, you could rise, you could lead, you could matter. This was radical. This was dangerous to the old order, but it was also incredibly effective. Warriors from defeated tribes began to join Temujin's forces. Why? Because they saw opportunity. They saw a path forward. They saw a man who valued them for who they were, not where they came from. One of the most important decisions Temujin made during this period was how he treated his enemies. When he defeated a tribe, he didn't simply destroy them. He didn't enslave them all. Instead, he offered them a choice. Join him, and you'll be treated with respect. You'll have opportunities. You'll be part of something greater. Refuse, and you'll be destroyed. It sounds harsh, and it was, but it was also pragmatic. It was also wise, because by offering this choice, Temujin was able to absorb defeated tribes into his growing confederation. He was able to add their warriors to his forces. He was able to grow stronger with each victory. He also did something else that was revolutionary. He reorganized the entire structure of tribal leadership. Instead of allowing traditional tribal leaders to maintain their power, he broke up the old tribal structures. He mixed warriors from different tribes together. He created new units based on merit and ability rather than kinship. He appointed commanders based on their skill and loyalty, not their bloodline. This was brilliant strategy. By breaking up the old tribal structures, he eliminated the possibility of rival power bases forming within his confederation. By mixing warriors from different tribes, he created a new identity. They weren't Tatars or Karat or Kayat anymore. They were Mongols. They were part of Temujin's army. They belonged to something new. As his power consolidated, Temujin began to attract even more followers. Warriors who'd been serving under other leaders began to desert their old masters and join Temujin's forces. Why? Because they could see which way the wind was blowing. They could see that Temujin was winning. They could see that he was building something that would last. But more than that, they could see that Temujin valued them. He rewarded loyalty. He promoted based on ability. He created a system where a man could rise from nothing to become a general, a leader, a person of importance. This was intoxicating to warriors who'd been trapped in rigid hierarchies their entire lives. By the time Hamuka and Toghrul Khan were finally defeated, Temujin had already begun to consolidate his power. The old tribal system was crumbling. The new order was emerging. And Temujin, the boy who'd been enslaved, the young man who'd been abandoned, was becoming the undisputed leader of the Mongol peoples. The transformation was nearly complete. He was no longer just a tribal leader. He was becoming something unprecedented. He was becoming the unifier of the steppes. He was becoming the man who would change the world. By the early years of the 1300s, Temujin had consolidated power over much of the Mongol plateau. But the work was far from finished. The steppes were still fragmented. There were still tribes that resisted his authority. There were still leaders who refused to acknowledge his supremacy. There were still pockets of resistance scattered across the grasslands. The Mongol tribes had never been truly united. For centuries, they'd existed in a state of constant conflict. The Tatars fought the Karat fought the Tatars. The Mongols fought everyone. The Tartars fought the Mongols. It was an endless cycle of violence and revenge. Tribes would form temporary alliances, fight a common enemy, then turn on each other once the threat was gone. This was simply how things were. This was the nature of steppe politics. But Temujin had a different vision. He didn't just want to be the strongest tribal leader. He didn't just want to command the largest army. He wanted something more ambitious. He wanted to unite all the Mongol tribes under one banner. He wanted to create a single nation out of dozens of warring peoples. He wanted to transform the steppes from a place of constant conflict into a place of unified purpose. This was an almost impossible dream, but Temüjin had learned to accomplish impossible things. His strategy was twofold. First, he used diplomacy. He sent emissaries to tribes that hadn't yet joined him. He made offers. He promised them a place in his new order. He promised them that if they joined him voluntarily, they would be treated with respect. Their leaders would retain some authority. Their people would be protected. But if they refused, if they resisted, then he would come for them with his army. Most tribes chose to join him. They could see which way the wind was blowing. They could see that Temüjin was winning. They could see that resistance was futile. So they submitted. They brought their warriors into his confederation. They accepted his authority, but some tribes refused. Some leaders couldn't accept the idea of serving under someone else. Some peoples had too much pride, too much history of independence to submit to Temüjin's rule. For these tribes there was only one option: war. Temüjin systematically defeated every tribe that resisted him. One by one he brought them to heel. His armies were disciplined and well organized. His tactics were superior to anything his enemies had ever faced. His generals were skilled and loyal, and his soldiers were motivated by something more than just the promise of plunder. They were motivated by belief in his vision. Among the tribes he defeated was the Tatars. Yes, the same Tatars who'd killed his father all those years ago. The same Tatars who'd enslaved him. Temüjin's revenge was complete and total. He didn't just defeat them, he essentially destroyed them as a tribe. He killed their leaders. He scattered their people. He absorbed their warriors into his army. The Tatars ceased to exist as an independent people. Was this cruel? Yes. But cruelty was the language of the steppes. Temüjin understood this. He understood that mercy was a luxury that could undermine his authority. He understood that if he showed weakness, if he showed compassion to those who'd wronged him, other tribes would see it as a sign of weakness. They would resist him. They would challenge him. So he did what was necessary. He did what the times demanded. The Carrot tribe, his former allies, also resisted. Genghis Khan was dead by this time, but his successors refused to accept Temüjin's authority. They thought they could maintain their independence. They thought they could resist. They were wrong. Temüjin defeated them as well. The Carrot, who'd once been so powerful, were absorbed into his confederation. As Temüjin conquered tribe after tribe, his reputation grew. People began to speak of him in hushed tones. They called him the man who could unite the impossible. They called him the man who could bring order to chaos. Some feared him. Some hated him. But all of them respected him. Internal dialogue. As Temüjin surveyed the steppes from his camp, watching the smoke rise from distant fires, watching the vast herds of horses and the thousands of warriors that gathered under his banners, he felt the weight of what he was doing. He thought, I have united them. The tribes that fought each other for centuries are now united under one rule. But at what cost? How many have died? How many families have been destroyed? How many tribes have been erased from history? And is it worth it? Is unity worth this price? He paused, and then he thought something else. Yes, it is. Because without unity, the steppes will continue to tear themselves apart. Without a strong hand, without a single vision, we will remain fragmented. We will remain weak. We will be conquered by others. But united, we are unstoppable. United, we can accomplish anything. The cost is high, but the alternative is worse. This internal struggle, this weight of leadership would stay with Temüjin for the rest of his life. He understood that he was making difficult choices. He understood that people were suffering. But he also understood that his vision was necessary, that his unity was necessary, that his rule was necessary. By around 1206, Temüjin had accomplished what no one thought was possible. He had united the Mongol tribes. The fragmented peoples of the steppes were now under one rule. The constant warfare had stopped. The endless cycle of revenge and counter-revenge had been broken. For the first time in history, the Mongols were united, and Temüjin, the boy who'd been enslaved, the young man who'd been abandoned, was ready to take the next step. He was ready to become something more than a tribal leader. He was ready to become an emperor. In the year 1206, Temüjin called for a great gathering. In Mongolian, it was called a kurultai. This was a council of tribal leaders, a meeting of the most important men on the steppes. But this kurultai was different from any that had come before. This wasn't a gathering of equals, debating who should lead. This was a coronation. This was the formal recognition of a new order. Thousands of people gathered on the steppes. Warriors, leaders, shamans, merchants, families. They came from across the Mongol plateau. They came to witness history. They came to see what Temüjin would do next. When the gathering was called to order, the tribal leaders formally recognized Temüjin's supremacy. They acknowledged that he was the strongest. They acknowledged that he was the wisest. They acknowledged that he had united them. And they chose him to be their supreme leader. They chose him to be Khan. But Temüjin didn't just accept this title passively. He used this moment to announce something revolutionary. He announced a new code of laws. He called it the Yasa. These weren't laws written on parchment or stone. These were laws that would be remembered and passed down orally. They were the fundamental rules by which his empire would operate. The Yasa established several crucial principles. First, it established that loyalty to the Khan superseded all other loyalties. Your tribe didn't matter anymore. Your family didn't matter anymore. What mattered was your loyalty to Temüjin and to his vision. This was radical. This was a complete break from traditional Mongol society, where tribal loyalty had always been paramount. Second, the Yasa established a meritocratic system of advancement. A man could rise based on his abilities, and his loyalty not based on his birth or his family connections. If you were skilled, if you were brave, if you were loyal, you could become a general. You could become a leader. You could become wealthy and powerful. This was unprecedented in the rigid hierarchies of the steppes. Third, the Yasa established severe punishments for disloyalty. If you betrayed the Khan, if you abandoned your post, if you broke your oath, the punishment was death. Not just for you, but potentially for your entire family. This sounds harsh, and it was. But it was also effective. It created a system where loyalty was absolute, where betrayal was unthinkable. But there was also something else in the Yasa. There was also mercy. There was also justice. The Yasa established that all people, regardless of their status, were subject to the same laws. A noble couldn't simply kill a commoner without consequence. A rich man couldn't simply take from a poor man. Everyone was equal before the Khan's law. This was also revolutionary. And then came the moment everyone was waiting for. Temüjin was formally crowned. He was given a new name. He was no longer Temüjin. He was now Genghis Khan. Genghis Khan means universal ruler, or ruler of all. It was a name that reflected his ambition. It was a name that reflected his vision. It was a name that said he didn't just rule the Mongols, he ruled everyone. Or at least, that was his intention. The coronation was accompanied by ceremonies and celebrations. There was feasting, there was music, there were displays of military power. Warriors rode their horses in formations. Archers demonstrated their skill. The gathered peoples could see the strength of Genghis Khan's army. They could see the discipline. They could see the organization. But beneath the celebration, there was something more serious happening. A new order was being established. The old ways were being swept away. The tribal system that had governed the steppes for centuries was being replaced with something new, something more centralized, something more powerful. Genghis Khan used this moment to make appointments. He appointed his most loyal followers to positions of power. Subutai, who'd stood with him since the beginning, was given command of a major division of the army. Other loyal followers were given administrative positions. They were given authority over territories. They were given responsibility for implementing his vision. These appointments weren't based on bloodline. They weren't based on family connections. They were based on loyalty and ability. Genghis Khan was putting his vision into practice immediately. He was showing everyone that the old rules no longer applied, that merit mattered, that loyalty was rewarded. As the Kurultai dispersed, as the tribal leaders returned to their territories, they carried with them the knowledge that everything had changed. The steppes had a new ruler. The steppes had a new order. And that ruler had a vision that extended far beyond the grasslands. Genghis Khan was just beginning. The world had no idea what was coming. Now that Genghis Khan had unified the tribes and established himself as supreme ruler, he faced a new challenge. He had an army, yes. He had warriors. He had people who'd sworn loyalty to him. But he didn't have a military machine. He didn't have the kind of organization that could conquer empires. He had to build that, and he had to build it quickly. Genghis Khan understood something fundamental about power. Raw strength wasn't enough. You could have the bravest warriors in the world, but if they weren't organized, if they weren't disciplined, if they didn't work together as a unified force, they could still be defeated by a smaller, better organized enemy. Organization was power. Discipline was power. Strategy was power. So Genghis Khan set about reorganizing his army. He created a decimal system. The basic unit was the arban, which consisted of 10 warriors. 10 arbans made up a jagun, which was 100 warriors. 10 jaguns made up a minghan, which was 1,000 warriors. And 10 minghans made up a tumen, which was 10,000 warriors. This might seem like a simple administrative structure, but it was revolutionary. It meant that every warrior knew exactly where they fit in the hierarchy. It meant that commands could be passed down efficiently from the top to the bottom. It meant that discipline could be enforced systematically. It meant that the entire army moved as one organism responding to commands with precision. But organization was only part of it. Genghis Khan also established strict discipline. Warriors who deserted were executed. Warriors who disobeyed orders were punished severely. Warriors who showed cowardice in battle were dishonored. But warriors who performed well, who showed bravery, who demonstrated loyalty, were rewarded. They were promoted. They were given authority. They were given a share of the spoils. This created a system where every warrior had incentive to perform well, where every warrior understood that their actions mattered, where every warrior knew that if they did their job, if they followed orders, if they fought with courage, they would be rewarded. Genghis Khan also created an elite unit called the Keshik. These were his personal bodyguards, but they were much more than that. The Keshik consisted of the most loyal, most skilled warriors in the entire army. They were chosen based on merit and loyalty. They served as Genghis Khan's personal guard, but they also served as a training ground for future leaders. Warriors who proved themselves in the Keshik were often promoted to command positions in the larger army. The Keshik was also a political tool. By bringing the sons of tribal leaders into the Keshik, Genghis Khan ensured their loyalty. These young men were essentially hostages, but they were treated well. They were trained. They were educated. They were given opportunities to advance, but they were also kept close to Genghis Khan, where he could monitor them and ensure they didn't become threats. Internal dialogue. As Genghis Khan watched his reorganized army drilling on the steppes, as he watched thousands of warriors moving in perfect formation, responding instantly to commands, he understood something profound. He thought, this is what power really is. Not individual strength, not the bravery of one man, but the coordination of many men working toward a single goal. This is what will allow me to conquer the world, not my sword arm, not my courage, but my ability to organize, my ability to discipline, my ability to make thousands of men move as one. The foundation was being laid. The military machine was being built. Genghis Khan now had an army that was unlike anything the world had ever seen. It was disciplined. It was organized. It was mobile. It was deadly. It was ready to conquer. But Genghis Khan wasn't satisfied with just having a good army. He wanted the best army. He wanted an army that could defeat anyone, anywhere, under any circumstances. And so he began to think about strategy. He began to think about tactics. He began to plan for the conquests that were to come. The steppes had been united. The tribes had been organized. The army had been reformed. Everything was in place. Genghis Khan was ready for the next phase. He was ready to look beyond the steppes. He was ready to conquer the world. When Genghis Khan began his campaigns of conquest, he didn't just rely on the strength of his warriors. He didn't just depend on their courage or their loyalty. He did something far more sophisticated. He created a military system that was fundamentally different from anything his enemies had ever encountered. He created the Mongol war machine. The first thing you need to understand about Mongol warfare is that it was built on mobility. The Mongols were horsemen. They'd been raiding since childhood. They could spend entire days in the saddle without tiring. They could navigate across vast distances with speed that seemed impossible to their enemies, and Genghis Khan understood that this mobility was his greatest advantage. Traditional armies of the time were slow. They moved on foot. They carried heavy equipment. They needed supply lines. They needed fortifications. They were tied to specific territories. But the Mongol army was different. A Mongol warrior could ride for days, covering distances that would take a traditional army weeks. A Mongol army could appear seemingly out of nowhere, strike with devastating force, and disappear before the enemy could mount an effective defense. Genghis Khan weaponized this mobility. He used it to strike at his enemies' weaknesses. He used it to avoid their strengths. He used it to control the pace and location of battle. His enemies would be expecting him in one place, and he'd appear in another. They'd be preparing their defenses, and he'd already moved on. This created a sense of helplessness. It created a sense that the Mongols could do anything, go anywhere, strike at will, but speed and mobility alone weren't enough. Genghis Khan also understood the power of psychological warfare. He understood that fear was a weapon. He understood that if you could make your enemy believe they were defeated before the battle even began, you'd already won half the fight. So the Mongols developed a reputation for terror. When a city refused to surrender when a people resisted Mongol rule, Genghis Khan would destroy them completely. He would slaughter the entire population. He would burn the city to the ground. He would leave nothing but ruins and death, and he would make sure that news of this destruction spread. He would make sure that the next city heard what had happened to those who resisted. This sounds brutal, and it was, but it was also effective. Cities that heard about the destruction of their neighbors often surrendered without a fight. They chose to submit to Mongol rule rather than face annihilation. In this way, Genghis Khan conquered vast territories with relatively little bloodshed. The threat of violence was often more effective than violence itself. But beneath this reputation for terror, there was also a system of mercy. If a city surrendered, if a people accepted Mongol rule, they were treated relatively well. They were allowed to keep their customs. They were allowed to keep their religions. They were incorporated into the Mongol system. But if they resisted, if they fought back, then the full force of Mongol fury would be unleashed upon them. This carrot-and-stick approach was brilliant strategy. It incentivized surrender. It made resistance seem foolish. It allowed Genghis Khan to conquer vast territories without having to fight every single battle to the death. Genghis Khan also understood the importance of adapting his tactics to different enemies and different terrains. The steppes were his home. He understood them completely. But as he expanded his empire, he encountered enemies who fought differently. He encountered cities with walls. He encountered armies with different weapons. He encountered terrains he'd never seen before, and instead of trying to force his traditional tactics onto these new situations, he adapted. He learned siege warfare from the Chinese. He incorporated siege equipment into his army. He learned to use catapults and battering rams. He learned to starve cities into submission. He learned to tunnel under walls. He was constantly learning, constantly adapting, constantly improving. He also incorporated conquered peoples into his army. When he defeated a tribe or a nation, he didn't just enslave them. He offered them the chance to join his army. Many accepted, and by incorporating them, Genghis Khan gained not just their numbers, but also their knowledge. He gained their weapons. He gained their tactics. He gained their understanding of their own territories. This was genius. It meant that his army was constantly growing. It meant that his army was constantly gaining new skills and new knowledge. It meant that each conquest made him stronger for the next conquest. Internal dialogue. As Genghis Khan reviewed his armies, as he watched warriors from a dozen different peoples training together, as he observed the integration of new siege equipment and new tactics, he understood something fundamental. He thought, "This is why I will succeed where others have failed. Not because my warriors are braver, not because I'm a better fighter, but because I understand that power comes from organization. Power comes from adaptation. Power comes from taking the best of what everyone has to offer and combining it into something greater than the sum of its parts. My enemies are strong, but they're rigid. They do things the way they've always done them. But I am flexible. I learn. I adapt. I improve. And that is why I will conquer them all." The Mongol war machine was unlike anything the world had ever seen. It was mobile. It was disciplined. It was adaptive. It was psychological. It was brutal when necessary and merciful when advantageous. It was a system designed to conquer, and it was devastatingly effective. Once Genghis Khan had unified the steppes and organized his military machine, he was ready to look beyond Mongolia. He was ready to conquer the world, and what followed was a series of military campaigns that would reshape the entire map of Asia and Europe. The first major target was the Jin dynasty in northern China. The Jin controlled vast territories and had enormous resources. They had cities with walls. They had armies numbering in the hundreds of thousands. By any reasonable measure, They should have been able to defeat the Mongols, but they didn't understand what they were facing. Genghis Khan's strategy against the Jin was masterful. He didn't try to conquer all of northern China at once. Instead, he attacked systematically, city by city, region by region. He used his mobility to strike at weak points. He used his psychological warfare to demoralize his enemies. He incorporated defeated warriors into his own army, making himself stronger with each victory. The Jin dynasty fought back fiercely, but they couldn't match the Mongol tactics. They were used to fighting defensive battles, protecting their cities and their territories. But the Mongols didn't fight that way. The Mongols attacked when and where the Jin least expected it. The Jin would prepare their defenses in one location, and the Mongols would strike somewhere else entirely. Over the course of more than a decade, Genghis Khan systematically conquered northern China. It was a slow process, but it was inexorable. The Jin dynasty was gradually pushed back their territories, shrinking their power, diminishing. By the time Genghis Khan died in 1227, northern China was essentially under Mongol control. His successors would complete the conquest, but the foundation was laid by Genghis Khan himself. But Genghis Khan wasn't content with just conquering China. He had his eyes on other prizes. To the west of Mongolia lay the Khwarezmian Empire, a vast Islamic state that controlled the Silk Road and the trade routes between east and west. The Khwarezmians were wealthy and powerful. They had a large army. They had fortified cities. They thought they were invulnerable. Genghis Khan decided to teach them otherwise. The campaign against the Khwarezmians began around 1219. Genghis Khan sent an embassy to the Khwarezmian Shah, the ruler of the empire. The embassy was meant to establish trade relations. But the Shah, either through arrogance or through poor judgment, decided to execute the Mongol ambassadors. This was a grave mistake. Genghis Khan responded with fury. He gathered his armies and marched west. The Khwarezmian Empire, which had seemed so powerful, crumbled before him. City after city fell. The Shah's armies were defeated in battle after battle. The Khwarezmians had never encountered anything like the Mongol war machine. Their traditional tactics were useless. Their fortifications were breached. Their armies were routed. The campaign was devastating. Entire cities were destroyed. Entire populations were slaughtered. The Khwarezmian Empire, which had stood for centuries, was essentially obliterated. What had taken the Khwarezmians generations to build Genghis Khan, destroyed in a matter of years. But the conquest of the Khwarezmian Empire had an unexpected consequence. It opened the door to Europe. Genghis Khan's generals, pursuing the fleeing Khwarezmian Shah, pushed further and further west. They crossed the Caucasus Mountains. They entered the steppes of southern Russia, and they discovered that Europe lay beyond. Genghis Khan sent his generals to scout Europe. He wanted to understand what lay to the west. He wanted to know if there were opportunities for conquest. What he learned was that Europe was fragmented. It was divided into dozens of kingdoms and principalities, each one fighting with the others. It was ripe for conquest. So Genghis Khan sent his armies to invade Europe. In 1237, his grandson, Batu Khan, led a massive Mongol force into Russia. The Russian principalities, unprepared for the Mongol onslaught, were defeated one by one. Cities fell. Armies were routed. The Mongols swept across Russia like a plague of locusts. From Russia, the Mongols pushed further west. They invaded Poland. They invaded Hungary. They defeated every army that stood against them. European knights armored and trained in medieval warfare were no match for Mongol archers on horseback. European generals used to fighting in their own territories couldn't match Mongol tactics and strategy. The Mongol invasion of Europe sent shockwaves through Christendom. People thought the end of the world had come. They called the Mongols the scourge of God, sent to punish humanity for its sins. But the Mongols weren't divine punishment. They were simply the most effective military force the world had ever seen. The scale of Genghis Khan's conquest was almost incomprehensible. At its height, the Mongol Empire stretched from the Pacific Ocean to the Black Sea. It covered an area larger than any empire in history. It encompassed dozens of different peoples, speaking dozens of different languages, practicing dozens of different religions. And all of it was united under Mongol rule. The speed of this expansion was unprecedented. In less than 50 years, the Mongols had gone from being a fragmented collection of tribes to ruling the largest contiguous land empire in history. No other empire had expanded so quickly. No other empire had conquered so much territory in so little time. Internal dialogue. As Genghis Khan stood on a hill overlooking one of his conquered cities, watching his armies march through the streets, watching the people bow before him, he contemplated what he'd accomplished. He thought, I have united the steppes. I have created an empire that stretches from the sunrise to the sunset. I have brought order to chaos. I have made the Mongol people the masters of the world. But this is not the end. This is only the beginning. There are still lands to conquer. There are still peoples to bring under Mongol rule. There's still so much more to do. He paused, and then he thought something else. And when I am gone, my sons and grandsons will continue the work. They will expand the empire even further. They will take what I have built and make it greater still. This is my legacy. This is what I will leave to the world. The Mongol conquests were made possible by a combination of factors: superior tactics, superior discipline, superior organization, superior mobility, superior use of intelligence and spies. Genghis Khan had spies everywhere, gathering information about his enemies, reporting on their movements, their strengths, their weaknesses. He knew more about his enemies than they knew about themselves. But perhaps most importantly, Genghis Khan's conquests were made possible by his willingness to adapt and learn. He wasn't bound by tradition. He wasn't constrained by the way things had always been done. He was constantly looking for new ways to improve his army, new ways to defeat his enemies, new ways to expand his empire. And it worked. It worked spectacularly. The Mongol Empire became the largest empire the world had ever known. And Genghis Khan became the most powerful man in history. But we need to pause here. We need to talk about something difficult. We need to talk about the cost of Genghis Khan's conquests. Because for all his genius, for all his vision, for all that he accomplished, there was a terrible price. And that price was paid in human lives. The number of people who died in Genghis Khan's campaigns is almost impossible to comprehend. Historians estimate that somewhere between 30 and 40 million people were killed during the Mongol conquests. Some estimates go even higher. To put that in perspective, the world population at that time was only around 360 million. Genghis Khan's conquests killed somewhere between 10 and 15% of all the people on Earth. Cities were destroyed completely. Entire civilizations were erased. The Khwarezmian Empire, which had stood for centuries, was obliterated. The Jin dynasty, which had ruled northern China for generations, was conquered and absorbed. Countless smaller kingdoms and principalities simply ceased to exist. When the Mongols conquered a city, the destruction was often total. They would slaughter the entire population: men, women, children. They would burn the buildings. They would destroy the crops. They would poison the wells. They would leave nothing but ruins and death. Entire cities that had thrived for centuries would become ghost towns, their streets empty of their buildings and ashes. The psychological impact on the survivors was devastating. People who'd lived their entire lives in one place suddenly found themselves ruled by foreign conquerors. Their old ways were gone. Their old leaders were dead. Everything they'd known was transformed. Families were separated. Children were taken to serve in the Mongol army. Women were taken as wives or slaves. Men were forced to serve as soldiers or laborers. The human toll of Genghis Khan's ambition was staggering, and it raises a difficult question, a question that historians have debated for centuries. Was it worth it? Did the benefits of Mongol rule justify the cost of conquest? Genghis Khan himself would have answered yes. He believed that his conquests brought order to chaos. He believed that his rule was better than the endless warfare that had preceded it. He believed that by unifying the world under Mongol rule, he was creating something greater than what had existed before. And there's some truth to this. Once the Mongol Empire was established, once the conquests were complete, there was a period of relative peace. Historians call it the Pax Mongolics, the Mongol peace. Trade flourished. The Silk Road became safer. Ideas and technologies spread between East and West. The Mongol Empire, for all its brutality, created a framework for communication and exchange that had never existed before. But this doesn't erase the cost. This doesn't bring back the millions who died. This doesn't restore the civilizations that were destroyed. This doesn't undo the suffering. Internal dialogue. Late in his life, as Genghis Khan reflected on what he'd accomplished, he must have wrestled with these questions. He thought, I have killed millions. I have destroyed cities. I have erased entire peoples from the face of the earth. Am I a monster? Am I a villain? Or am I a visionary who did what was necessary? He paused and then he continued. The steppes were fragmented. The tribes fought each other endlessly. People suffered under the old system. They suffered under constant warfare. I brought order. I brought peace. Yes, the cost was high. Yes, millions died, but they died so that millions more could live in peace. They died so that their children and grandchildren could live under a unified rule. They died so that the world could be transformed. But even as he justified his actions, even as he convinced himself that the cost was worth it, there must have been doubts. There must have been moments when he wondered if there had been another way, if there had been a path to unity that didn't require so much death, if there had been a way to bring order without bringing so much destruction. We'll never know what Genghis Khan truly felt about the cost of his conquests. We can only speculate based on the historical record. But what we do know is that he continued his campaigns. He continued to conquer. He continued to expand his empire. Whatever doubts he may have had, they didn't stop him from pursuing his vision. And that's perhaps the most important lesson of all. That sometimes the pursuit of great things requires terrible costs. That sometimes the creation of something new requires the destruction of something old. That sometimes the visionaries who change the world are also the ones who cause the most suffering. It's a moral complexity that we can't ignore. It's a truth that we have to sit with even if it makes us uncomfortable. Conquering an empire is one thing. Governing it is something entirely different. Genghis Khan understood this. He understood that he couldn't just rule through fear and military might alone. He had to create systems. He had to create structures. He had to create an empire that could actually function, that could actually govern the vast territories he'd conquered. At its height, the Mongol Empire was the largest contiguous land empire in history. It stretched from the Pacific Ocean in the east to the Black Sea in the west. It covered an area of more than 13 million square kilometers. It encompassed dozens of different peoples, speaking dozens of different languages, practicing dozens of different religions. Holding all of this together required genius. And Genghis Khan had that genius. One of his greatest innovations was the postal system. The Mongols established a network of relay stations across the entire empire. These stations were spaced a day's journey apart. A rider could stop at one station, get a fresh horse, and continue on. In this way, messages could travel across the entire empire with remarkable speed. Information could flow from the capital to the farthest reaches of the empire and back again. This was crucial for maintaining control over such a vast territory. The postal system also served another purpose. It allowed Genghis Khan to maintain intelligence networks. Spies could travel along the postal routes. They could report back to the capital about what was happening in distant regions. Genghis Khan always knew what was going on in his empire. He always knew if there were rebellions brewing. He always knew if local governors were becoming too powerful. He always knew if there were problems that needed to be addressed. Genghis Khan also understood the importance of trade. He realized that if his empire was going to prosper, if it was going to survive, it needed to generate wealth. And the best way to generate wealth was through trade. So he made a conscious decision to protect the Silk Road. He made it safe for merchants to travel. He established rules and regulations that made trade predictable and profitable. The result was a flourishing of commerce. Merchants from China traded with merchants from Persia. Merchants from Europe traded with merchants from Central Asia. Ideas flowed along with goods. Technologies spread. Art and culture were exchanged. The Silk Road became more active, more prosperous, more important than it had ever been before. But Genghis Khan didn't just allow trade to happen randomly. He controlled it. He taxed it. He regulated it. He made sure that the Mongol Empire benefited from the prosperity that trade created. In this way, he was able to generate enormous wealth without having to rely solely on conquest and plunder. Another key to Genghis Khan's success was religious tolerance. This might seem surprising for a man known for his brutality. But Genghis Khan understood that if he tried to force all his subjects to follow one religion, he would create endless conflict. So instead, he allowed people to practice their own religions. Muslims could practice Islam. Christians could practice Christianity. Buddhists could practice Buddhism. Confucianists could practice Confucianism. As long as people paid their taxes and remained loyal to the Khan, they could believe whatever they wanted. This was revolutionary for the time. In most medieval societies, religious uniformity was considered essential. But Genghis Khan understood that religious diversity didn't have to be a problem. It could actually be an advantage. It meant that his subjects were less likely to rebel based on religious grounds. It meant that he could draw talent and expertise from all religions and all cultures. Genghis Khan established his capital at Karakorum in the heart of Mongolia. Karakorum was a city unlike anything that had existed on the steppes before. It had palaces and temples. It had markets and workshops. It had people from all over the empire. It was a symbol of Mongol power and sophistication. It was a place where East and West met, where different cultures blended together. The blending of cultures was one of the most important aspects of Genghis Khan's empire. He didn't try to impose Mongol culture on everyone. Instead, he allowed different cultures to coexist. He borrowed ideas from the Chinese. He borrowed administrative techniques from the Persians. He borrowed military innovations from everyone he conquered. He created a synthesis, a blending of different traditions into something new. This cultural synthesis was one of the reasons the Mongol Empire was so successful. It allowed the empire to adapt to different regions. It allowed local traditions to continue while still maintaining Mongol rule. It created a sense that the Mongol Empire was something that belonged to everyone, not just to the Mongols themselves. Internal dialogue. As Genghis Khan sat in his palace at Karakorum watching merchants from a dozen different countries conducting business in the marketplace, below watching scholars from different religions debating philosophy, watching artists from different cultures creating new works, he contemplated what he'd created. He thought, this is what I envisioned. Not just an empire of conquest, but an empire of unity. An empire where different peoples can live together, where different ideas can flourish, where trade can prosper, where knowledge can spread. I have conquered half the world, yes, but more importantly, I have created something that can last, something that can grow, something that can endure long after I am gone. But Genghis Khan also understood that maintaining an empire required constant vigilance. He had to balance the needs of different regions. He had to manage competing interests. He had to ensure that local governors didn't become too powerful. He had to maintain military strength while also promoting trade and prosperity. It was a delicate balance, and it was one that Genghis Khan managed with remarkable skill. He created an empire that was both powerful and prosperous, an empire that was both unified and diverse, an empire that could conquer and also govern, an empire that would outlast him by centuries. Behind the title of Genghis Khan, behind the legend, behind the fearsome reputation, there was a man with feelings, a man with relationships, a man with vulnerabilities and doubts. And to understand Genghis Khan fully, we need to understand this man. We need to see beyond the conqueror and glimpse the person beneath. Genghis Khan had many wives. This was common among Mongol leaders. A man's wealth and status were partly measured by the number of wives he had. But among all his wives, there was one who held a special place in his heart. Her name was Berta. Genghis Khan had married Berta when he was still young, still poor, still struggling to survive on the steppes. She was from a different tribe, but he'd chosen her as his wife. And he loved her, genuinely loved her in a way that transcended the political marriages that were common among the nobility. But Berta had been kidnapped. Early in their marriage, before Genghis Khan had become powerful, before he had the means to protect her, she was taken by the Tatars. The same Tatars who'd killed his father, the same Tatars who'd enslaved him. They took her as revenge, as a way to humiliate him. Berta was held captive for years. When she was finally returned to Genghis Khan, she was pregnant. The child she bore might have been his, or it might have been the child of one of her captors. No one knew for certain, but Genghis Khan accepted the child as his own. He raised him as his son. He never questioned Berta's loyalty or her honor. This act of forgiveness and acceptance reveals something important about Genghis Khan. Beneath the ruthless conqueror, there was a man capable of love, capable of compassion, capable of understanding that sometimes people were victims of circumstances beyond their control. Berta remained his primary wife for the rest of his life. Even as he took other wives, even as he fathered children with other women, Berta held a special place. She was his anchor. She was the one person who knew him before he became the great Khan. She was the one person who could see the man beneath the legend. But if Genghis Khan's relationship with Berta was characterized by love, his relationships with his sons were characterized by complexity and struggle. Genghis Khan had several sons, and he loved them all. But he also knew that they would be fighting for power after his death. He knew that the succession would be difficult. He knew that his empire could fracture if his sons couldn't work together. He tried to prepare them for leadership. He gave them responsibilities. He had them lead military campaigns. He tested them, but he also worried about them. He worried that they weren't ready. He worried that they would fight each other instead of working together. He worried that everything he'd built would fall apart after he was gone. One of his sons, Jochi, was the product of Berta's captivity. There were always questions about his legitimacy. Some people whispered that he wasn't truly Genghis Khan's son. This created tension. It created uncertainty about the line of succession. Genghis Khan loved Jochi, but he also knew that Jochi's legitimacy would always be questioned. Another son, Chagatai, was fierce and ambitious. He was a skilled warrior and a capable leader, but he was also proud and stubborn. Genghis Khan worried that Chagatai would be too harsh, too rigid to govern effectively. His youngest son, Tolui, was his favorite in many ways. Tolui was intelligent and capable, but he was also the youngest, and Genghis Khan wasn't sure if he was ready for the responsibility of leadership. And then there was Ogedei, his third son. Ogedei was intelligent and diplomatic. He was skilled at managing people and resources. Genghis Khan eventually decided that Ogedei would be his successor. But even this decision created tension and uncertainty. Internal dialogue. Late in his life, as Genghis Khan contemplated his mortality, as he thought about what would happen to his empire after he was gone, he wrestled with deep fears. He thought, "I have conquered the world. I have built an empire that stretches from the sunrise to the sunset. I have accomplished things that no man has ever accomplished. But what will happen when I am gone? Will my sons fight each other? Will they tear apart everything I've built? Will my empire fracture into pieces? I have spent my life building something great, but I cannot control what happens after I die. And that terrifies me." The loneliness of absolute power is a theme that runs through Genghis Khan's later life. He had everything. He had power beyond measure. He had wealth beyond counting. He had an empire that covered half the world. But he was also utterly alone. There was no one he could truly confide in. There was no one he could truly trust completely. Everyone around him wanted something from him. Everyone had an agenda. Even his family relationships were complicated by power and politics. His sons weren't just his sons. They were also potential rivals. His wives weren't just his wives. They were also political allies or potential threats. Everyone in his life was filtered through the lens of power and politics. This is the tragedy of absolute power. It isolates you. It separates you from genuine human connection. Genghis Khan had conquered the world, but in doing so, he'd also lost something essential. He'd lost the ability to be truly human, to be truly vulnerable, to be truly loved for who he was, rather than for what he could give or what he could take away. If we step back and look at Genghis Khan's life as a whole, if we trace the arc from the boy named Temüjin to the man who conquered the world, we can see something profound. We can see how his suffering shaped him, how his early powerlessness became the foundation for his later power, how his trauma transformed into strength. The boy who was enslaved learned what it meant to be powerless. He learned what it felt like to have no control over your own life. He learned what it meant to be treated as less than human. And these lessons, as painful as they were, taught him something crucial. They taught him that power matters, that organization matters, that the ability to control your own destiny matters more than anything else. When Temüjin became Genghis Khan, when he rose to absolute power, he never forgot what it felt like to have nothing. He never forgot the taste of slavery. He never forgot the humiliation of being abandoned by his tribe. And this memory drove him. It drove him to build something that could never be taken away. It drove him to create an empire so vast, so powerful, that no one could ever threaten it. His early powerlessness also shaped his vision of what leadership should be. Because he'd been rejected, because he'd been cast out, because he'd been treated as worthless, he understood the importance of loyalty. He understood that people needed to feel valued. They needed to feel like they mattered. They needed to feel like their contributions were recognized and rewarded. This understanding became the foundation of his leadership philosophy. He didn't rule through fear alone. He ruled through loyalty. He created a system where people could rise based on merit, where people could achieve status and wealth through their own efforts, where people felt like they had a stake in the empire's success. The connection between his past and his future is undeniable. The boy who had nothing became the man who had everything. The boy who was powerless became the man who held absolute power. The boy who was abandoned became the man who created the largest empire in history. His suffering didn't break him. It forged him. It shaped him into something extraordinary. Trauma can transform into strength. Pain can become power. Suffering can become wisdom. This is one of the most important lessons of Genghis Khan's life. He didn't let his suffering destroy him. He didn't let his pain paralyze him. Instead, he used it. He channeled it. He transformed it into something that changed the world. And perhaps most importantly, Genghis Khan's life teaches us about the power of vision and persistence. He had a vision of a unified Mongolia. He had a vision of an empire that stretched across continents. He had a vision of a world united under one rule, and he pursued that vision relentlessly. He faced obstacles. He faced defeats. He faced enemies that seemed insurmountable. But he never gave up. He never stopped believing in his vision, and eventually he achieved it. This is the lesson that resonates most powerfully. Not that suffering is good, not that pain is necessary, but that suffering can be transformed, that pain can be channeled, that trauma can become the foundation for greatness. If we can learn to do what Genghis Khan did, if we can transform our own suffering into strength, if we can pursue our vision with his persistence, then we too can accomplish extraordinary things. Genghis Khan died in 1227. The exact circumstances of his death aren't entirely clear from history. Some sources say he was thrown from a horse. Some say he died from illness. Some say he was wounded in battle. But what we do know is that he died knowing his empire was secure, knowing that his vision would outlive him. Before his death, Genghis Khan made arrangements for the succession. He named his son Ogedei as his successor. This was a deliberate choice. Ogedei wasn't the oldest son, but Genghis Khan believed he was the most capable of holding the empire together. And he was right. Ogedei proved to be a skilled administrator and military leader. He continued his father's work of expansion and consolidation. After Genghis Khan's death, the empire didn't fragment immediately. Instead, it continued to grow. Ogedei expanded the empire further into Europe and deeper into Asia. His successors continued the work. Genghis Khan's grandsons conquered Baghdad. They conquered Korea. They conquered vast territories in Russia and Eastern Europe. The Mongol Empire reached its greatest extent under Genghis Khan's successors, but eventually the empire did begin to fragment. The vast distances, the diversity of peoples, the competing interests of different Khans made it impossible to maintain unified control. The empire split into 4 major Khanates: the Golden Horde in Russia, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, the Ilkhanate in Persia, the Yuan dynasty in China. These Khanates were nominally under the authority of the Great Khan in Mongolia, but in practice, they operated independently. Over the course of centuries, Mongol rule gradually weakened. Local populations rebelled. New powers emerged. The Mongol Khans lost their military superiority. By the end of the 14th century, Mongol rule had essentially ended. The Yuan dynasty in China fell to the Ming dynasty. The Golden Horde fragmented into smaller Khanates. The Ilkhanate collapsed. The Mongol Empire, which had seemed so eternal, so invincible, was gone. But even though Mongol political rule ended, Genghis Khan's legacy lived on. The Silk Road continued to flourish. Trade continued to flow between East and West. Ideas continued to be exchanged. Technologies continued to spread. The postal system that Genghis Khan had established continued to operate. The administrative structures he'd created continued to function. Most importantly, the world had been transformed. East and West were no longer isolated from each other. They were connected. They were in communication. They were exchanging goods, ideas, technologies, and culture. This transformation, this connection was Genghis Khan's greatest legacy. Internal dialogue. If Genghis Khan could have seen the future, if he could have known that his political empire would eventually fall, would he have been disappointed? Perhaps. But perhaps not. Because his vision wasn't just about creating an empire that would last forever. His vision was about transforming the world, about connecting peoples who'd never been connected before, about creating a framework for trade and communication that would outlast any political structure. And in that sense, his vision did outlive him. It outlived his empire. It continues to shape our world, even today. Genghis Khan changed warfare forever. The tactics he developed, the strategies he pioneered influenced military thinking for centuries. Commanders studied Mongol warfare. They tried to understand how such a small force could defeat such large armies. They tried to replicate Mongol tactics, and many of them succeeded. The influence of Mongol military strategy can be seen in the armies of the Ottoman Empire, the Russian Empire, and many others. But beyond warfare, Genghis Khan's impact was even more profound. He opened trade routes. He made it safe for merchants to travel. He created a framework for communication between distant peoples. The result was an unprecedented exchange of goods, ideas, and technologies. Chinese innovations spread to the Islamic world and to Europe. Islamic innovations spread to China and to Europe. European innovations spread to Asia. Knowledge that had been isolated in different regions suddenly became accessible to everyone. This exchange had enormous consequences. It accelerated technological development. It spread innovations in agriculture, in manufacturing, in warfare, in medicine. It created a more interconnected world. It laid the foundation for the modern global economy. But there were also unintended consequences. The Mongol conquests spread disease along with goods and ideas. The Black Plague, which devastated Europe in the 14th century, may have been spread along Mongol trade routes. The Mongol conquests also disrupted existing power structures. They destroyed civilizations. They killed millions. They caused immense suffering. So how do we remember Genghis Khan as a conqueror or as a visionary, as a villain or as a hero? The answer is that he was both. He was neither purely evil nor purely good. He was a man of his time with the values of his time. He did terrible things. He also accomplished extraordinary things. His legacy is complex. It's contradictory. It's impossible to reduce to simple categories. As you're lying there, as your eyes are getting heavier, as you're drifting towards sleep, I want you to think about what Genghis Khan's story teaches us. Not about conquest, not about empire, but about something more personal, something more relevant to your own life. His story teaches us about resilience, about the ability to bounce back from adversity. Genghis Khan faced rejection. He faced slavery. He faced abandonment. He faced enemies that seemed insurmountable, but he didn't give up. He kept moving forward. He kept believing in his vision. And eventually he succeeded. His story teaches us about the power of vision and persistence. Genghis Khan had a dream of a unified Mongolia, a dream of an empire that stretched across continents. And he pursued that dream relentlessly. He faced obstacles. He faced defeats. But he never stopped. He never gave up. He kept pushing forward until his vision became reality. His story teaches us that adversity can forge strength, that suffering can transform us, that the things that hurt us, the things that challenge us, the things that seem to break us, can actually make us stronger if we learn from them, if we use them, if we transform them into something positive. His story teaches us about loyalty and trust. Genghis Khan understood that you couldn't accomplish great things alone. You needed people who believed in you. You needed people who would stand beside you when everything seemed impossible. And he rewarded that loyalty. He created a system where people felt valued, where people felt like they mattered. His story teaches us about organization and strategy, that raw power isn't enough, that you need systems, you need structure, you need to think carefully about how to accomplish your goals. You need to be willing to adapt and learn. And finally, his story teaches us about the complexity of power and responsibility, about the difficult choices that leaders have to make, about the fact that doing great things sometimes requires terrible costs, about the loneliness of power, about the importance of thinking carefully about how we use the power we have. Internal dialogue. What would Genghis Khan want us to understand? I think he'd want us to understand that our struggles matter, that our pain isn't wasted, that the things we endure can become the foundation for greatness. He'd want us to understand that we're capable of more than we think, that we can accomplish extraordinary things if we have vision and persistence. He'd want us to understand that loyalty and trust are precious, that the people who stand beside us are more valuable than any amount of wealth or power. And he'd want us to understand that we have a responsibility to use whatever power we have wisely, to think carefully about the consequences of our actions, to remember that our choices affect others, to strive to create something that will outlast us, something that will make the world better. So here we are at the end of this story. We've traveled from the harsh steppes of Mongolia to the palaces of Karakoram. We've watched a boy named Temüjin transform into Genghis Khan, the most powerful man in history. And now, as you're lying there, as sleep is calling to you, I want to leave you with something to think about. The paradox we started with has been resolved. How did a slave become an emperor? How did someone with nothing become someone with everything? The answer is simple, really. He refused to accept his circumstances. He refused to believe that his past determined his future. He took the suffering he'd endured and transformed it into strength. He took the rejection he'd experienced and transformed it into determination. He took the powerlessness he'd felt and transformed it into vision. The key elements were resilience, vision, strategy, loyalty. But more than anything, it was transformation. Genghis Khan's story is ultimately a story about transformation, about how a person can change, about how circumstances can change, about how the world can change. And that's why his story matters to you. Because you're facing your own challenges. You're facing your own obstacles. You're facing your own steps to cross. Maybe your steps aren't made of grass and wind. Maybe they're made of doubt and fear and uncertainty. But they're real. And they're difficult. And sometimes they seem impossible to cross. But Genghis Khan's story reminds us that others have faced impossible odds. Others have stood where you're standing. Others have felt what you're feeling. And they've found a way through. They found a way to transform their suffering into strength. They found a way to pursue their vision, despite the obstacles. You don't have to conquer the world. You don't have to build an empire. You just have to keep moving forward. You just have to believe in yourself. You just have to remember that your struggles are not wasted. They are part of your story, just like Temüjin's struggles were part of his. The world remembers Genghis Khan as a conqueror, as a visionary, as a man who changed history. But before he was any of those things, he was just a boy who refused to give up. He was just a young man who believed in something greater than himself. He was just a person who kept moving forward, even when everything seemed impossible. And that's what I want you to remember as you drift towards sleep. Not the conquest, not the empire, but the transformation, the resilience, the refusal to accept defeat, the belief that something better is possible, the understanding that your struggles can become your strength. As you're lying there, as your eyes are getting heavier, as you're drifting towards sleep, hold on to this thought. Hold on to the idea that you're capable of more than you think. Hold on to the idea that your struggles are not wasted. Hold on to the idea that transformation is possible. For now, though, just rest. You've earned it. You're doing the best you can. And that's enough. Sleep well, my friend. Sleep well. Tomorrow is a new day. Tomorrow you'll face new challenges. Tomorrow you'll take another step on your own journey. But tonight rest. Let your mind settle. Let your body relax. Let yourself drift into sleep, knowing that you're stronger than you think. Knowing that you're capable of more than you realize. Knowing that your story, like Genghis Khan's, is still being written. The steps are vast. The journey is long. But you're not alone. Others have walked this path before you. Others have faced what you're facing. Others have found their way through. And so will you. Sleep now. Rest well. And when you wake, remember this story. Remember the boy who became an emperor. Remember that transformation is possible. Remember that resilience matters. Remember that your vision, your persistence, your refusal to give up these things matter more than you know. Good night. Sleep well. You've earned your rest.